Mario Ortiz was a man forged in logic and steel, the architect of a steel empire that rose over the industrial landscape of Mexico City as a monument to his own intellect. At 40, his life was a perfectly balanced equation, where every variable was controlled with surgical precision. He didn't build his legacy with charisma, but with a cold, methodical mind that saw the world as a series of problems to be solved. In his hands, raw ore transformed into beams that supported skyscrapers, and he believed that society, much like metal, could be shaped by the force of reason and order. His trajectory was a relentless ascent, rising from nothing to become one of the most respected men in the country, a titan of industry who nevertheless maintained an emotional distance from everything and everyone, as if observing his own life through bulletproof glass. At the core of his perfectly calculated universe, there was a warmth that he himself rarely managed to generate. His wife, Elena, and their 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, they were the only exception to his logic, the only variable he didn't try to control, but merely to protect. It's because of stories like his that I feel the need to speak, to share what happens when a man's world crumbles. I ask that if this narrative touches you in any way, you subscribe to the channel. Our goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers so that these voices are not lost in the silence. Comment where you're watching from, so I know I'm not just shouting into the void. Mario's journey needs to be heard, as it reflects the darkness that many face when justice becomes just a word. The Ortiz mansion in the affluent neighborhood of Las Lomas was a sanctuary of sterile luxury, a reflection of its master's soul. The white walls and minimalist decor contrasted violently with Sophia's laughter echoing through the halls, or with the way Elena filled the spaces with her vibrant presence. Mario loved them with an intensity that frightened him, a love he expressed through security and provision, not demonstrative affection. He saw his family as his greatest project, the ultimate proof that he could build something perfect and immaculate, a refuge against the chaos he knew simmered outside the high walls of his property. He felt like the guardian of a fragile treasure, not realizing that the greatest threats wouldn't try to scale the walls, but simply break down the front door. His empire, Ortiz Steelworks, was the opposite of his home, a monster of fire and smoke on the industrial outskirts of the city, where the air smelled of burnt metal and the dominant sound was the roar of the furnaces. There, Mario was in his element. Walking the metal catwalks, he didn't see workers, but cogs in a complex machine. He knew every process, every point of failure, every decibel of noise that indicated a problem. His mind reveled in that controllable complexity. It was a world of cause and effect, where brute force was tamed by engineering. This mastery over steel gave him a false sense of power over the world, the belief that any force, no matter how wild, could be contained, shaped, or if necessary, destroyed by a superior will and unlimited resources. Mexico City in the 1990s breathed a dangerous duality. By day, it was a pulsating business hub, with executives closing deals in luxury restaurants and the promise of modernity in every new construction. At night, however, the city revealed its dark face. The news in the papers that Mario absent-mindedly read spoke of kidnappings, the rise of cartels, and a corruption that infiltrated institutions like a cancer. To him, these were statistical data, anomalies in a system that, for the most part, worked. He considered himself untouchable, protected by his wealth and influence, an ivory tower from which he observed the problems of the common people as if they belonged to another reality, one that would never cross his path. This arrogance, born of logic and not malice, would be his first fatal mistake. Arturo Morales, his head of security and an ex-military man, was the only dissenting voice in his choir of subordinates. A man of few words and eyes that saw more than they should. Arturo often warned Mario about the fragility of his security. He spoke of new players in the city, men with a different kind of brutality, who didn't respect the old rules of the underworld. Mario listened with condescending patience, approving the purchase of armored cars and the hiring of more guards, treating security as just another system to be optimized. He did not understand the nature of the evil Arturo described, an evil that was not logical, that sought not just profit, but reveled in chaos and pain, a force of nature that could not be forecasted on his spreadsheets. There was a sacred routine Mario never broke, putting Sofia to bed every night. In that childish room, decorated with stars that glowed in the dark, the steel magnate became just a father. He read her stories of knights and dragons, tales where good always triumphed and monsters were defeated. Sofia's head rested on his chest, and the scent of her hair was the only thing that could silence the incessant noise of calculations in his mind. That particular night, she asked him to promise that no monster would ever get her. Mario smiled, a rare and genuine smile, and assured her that he was the strongest man in the world and would protect her from everything. It was the last promise he ever made her, a promise that would echo in his soul as an eternal damnation. Later, in his office, with the city sparkling below, Mario watched the horizon with a sense of pride and control. The glass of whiskey in his hand reflected the distant lights. Everything in his life was exactly where it should be. His company was thriving, his family was safe, and the future seemed a straight, ascending line. He was Mario Ortiz, a man who bent the world to his will. He didn't hear the subtle sound of the gate being forced. He didn't feel the vibration in the air as the order of his universe was irrevocably shattered. He remained there, the king in his glass castle, completely blind to the fact that the monsters from his daughter's stories were real, and they were already inside the house, hungry and ready to devour his world. The sound that tore through the tranquility was not an explosion, but the sharp shatter of glass downstairs, followed by Elena's choked-off scream. Mario's whiskey fell from his hand, staining the Persian rug with cruel indifference. The lights of the mansion flickered and died, plunging everything into a darkness that was more than the absence of light. It was the absence of order. His security panel, normally a beacon of green status lights, was dead. He was blind inside his own fortress. Panic, an emotion he considered a design flaw in others, tried to rise in his throat but was suppressed by a wave of cold adrenaline. Every problem-solving instinct in his body screamed that this was an equation he could not control. The silence that followed the scream was the most terrifying of all, a vacuum where his family's life used to exist. Moving through the darkness, every shadow seemed a threat. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone and a cheap perfume that didn't belong in his home. He found them in the living room, the scene lit only by the bluish moonlight streaming through the broken window. 3 men, their faces masks of cruel banality, held Elena, who was struggling to shield little Sofia behind her. Mario froze, his brain processing the scene with horrific clarity. He saw the gun, the fear in his wife's eyes, and the confusion on his daughter's face. Before he could react, a 4th man struck him from behind, throwing him to the floor. "Take a good look, millionaire." The attacker's voice was harsh and mocking. "See what your money can't buy." He was forced to watch, helpless, as the foundation of his world was demolished by gunfire. The echo of the gunshots was replaced by a deep, absolute silence. The men were gone, taking with them all sound, movement, and the future. Mario lay on the floor for what could have been seconds or an eternity, the sound of his own blood pulsing in his ears. The physical pain from the blow to his head was insignificant compared to the fracture in his soul. Slowly, he crawled to the bodies of his wife and daughter. The logic that governed his life dissolved. There were no variables, no solutions. There was only a final, brutal, senseless result. He touched Elena's face, still warm, and then Sophia's hair spread like a dark halo on the marble floor. The man who was Mario Ortiz, the builder, the master of steel, died in that room, leaving behind only an empty shell filled with a cold, heavy pain. The investigation was a grotesque farce. Detectives with tired eyes and rehearsed sympathy asked questions they didn't want answers to. The crime scene was contaminated with an incompetence that Mario, with his methodical mind, could only interpret as intentional. In the days that followed, he used his resources not for grief, but for information. Hackers on his company's payroll intercepted communications, and what he discovered was more devastating than the bullets themselves. The killers belonged to the cartel of Ricardo El Chacal Vargas, a man so powerful his name was whispered in fear in the highest echelons of government. The police had been ordered to shelve the case. Justice wasn't blind. It was bought and gagged. The system upon which he had built his life was not just broken, it was a cog in the same machine that had crushed his family. In the solitude of his office days later, Mario looked at the last photo of Elena and Sophia smiling. The raw pain had crystallized into something new, a frigid clarity and an absolute determination. The promise he had made to his daughter to protect her from monsters became a new kind of oath. The system had failed. The law was a joke. Society was a shadow play. If there was no justice in the world, he would create it. He would no longer seek anyone's help. He would no longer wait for a justice that would never come. He would take the pain, the rage, the fortune, and the intellect he possessed and forge them into a weapon. In that moment, he decided to act. He would no longer be a victim. He would become a predator. He would hunt every man responsible, from the one who pulled the trigger to the one who sat at the top of the food chain. Vengeance was not enough. What he would seek was a rebalancing, a justice forged in iron and fire. The world wrote Mario Ortiz off as dead, a soul drowned in grief. His absence from public life was interpreted as the collapse of a man who had lost everything, but in truth he had been reborn in fire and darkness, beneath the foundations of his steelworks. In a forgotten bunker designed during the Cold War era, he built his new universe. The air was thick with the smell of metal and gun, oil, and the only sound was the hum of servers and the echo of his own grunts of effort. Surrounded by monitors displaying the city's data streams, he wasn't hiding from the world. He was dissecting it, mapping its corrupt arteries with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a radical operation, one that would excise the cancer rotting the city from within. His first and only call was to Arturo Morales. The ex-military man found a man he didn't recognize. Grief had chiseled Mario's face, removing any trace of his former arrogance and leaving behind a granitic determination. Mario didn't ask. He informed him of his plan. There would be no appeals to justice or speeches about good and evil. He simply presented the problem and his brutal solution. Arturo, a man whose loyalty had been forged in years of service and who saw the same rot in the system his boss now saw, hesitated. He didn't fear the violence, but Mario's soul. However, looking into his boss's eyes, he saw a man already condemned, and knew his only choice was to accompany him into the darkness, to perhaps be the last anchor to his humanity. What followed was a brutal transformation. Mario forced his body to match the fury of his mind. The mornings were a ritual of pain, pushing his muscles beyond exhaustion, turning the soft flesh of an executive into the hardened fiber of a hunter. He wasn't seeking the perfection of an action hero, but the functional endurance of a tool. Every aching muscle, every gasping breath was a form of penance and a focus that kept him from drowning in the memories of his family. He learned to shoot not with the elegance of a professional, but with lethal stability. He learned to fight, to move unseen, to turn the urban landscape into his ally. Grief was the fuel, and vengeance was the furnace that shaped him. In parallel, He and Arturo built an arsenal that merged industrial brutality with cutting-edge technology. Using the experimental metal alloys and fabrication equipment from his own company, they created untraceable weapons and infiltration tools. The centerpiece of his new identity was the mask. Forged from a titanium steel alloy, it was a smooth, featureless plate, polished to a dull sheen that absorbed light. It wasn't a mask to inspire heroism, but to project emptiness. It was the nullification of Mario Ortiz. By wearing it, he left behind the man who felt pain, the father, the husband. He became a concept, an impersonal force, a ghost whose only identity was the retribution he brought with him in the dead of night. His war began in cyberspace. Mario the engineer built a parallel surveillance network, a digital web that infiltrated police systems, bank records, and the cartel's communication networks. He was a ghost in the machines before he became one in the streets. He spent days awake, fueled by caffeine and hatred, tracking the men who had been in his house that night. He learned their names, their habits, their fears. He watched, hid them through hacked security cameras and GPS trackers planted by Arturo. The first name on his list was a low-level sicario named Hector, a man whose brutality was as casual as his breathing. Mario planned his approach with the same meticulousness he would use to design a bridge, ensuring the structural integrity of his revenge. The first night he went out as the ghost was cold and damp. The mask felt like a cold, second skin, and the weight of the gear on his body was a constant reminder of the path he had chosen. He felt no fear, only a strange, chilling calm. The Mario Ortiz who loved his family would have been terrified, but he was no longer there. In his place was an entity driven by a single purpose. He watched Hector from a rooftop, seeing him laugh with his friends in a grimy bar. He didn't see a man, but a faulty component in a system he was going to dismantle. The hunt was not for sport or rage. It was a necessity, like an engineer needing to remove a broken part so the machine doesn't collapse. The confrontation happened in a dark alley that reeked of garbage and despair. Hector, drunk and complacent, didn't notice the shadow detaching from the wall until it was too late. The ghost didn't move with the grace of a trained assassin, but with the mechanical efficiency of a piston. The fight was ugly, clumsy, and brutally real. Hector, a man accustomed to violence, mocked him, but the silence and relentless force of his attacker turned his arrogance into panic. Mario felt Hector's bones break in his hands, heard his scream of terror turn into a whimper. The death was not clean. It was a visceral, horrifying act that left him gasping, Hector's blood warm on his gloves. Justice, he discovered, had a sickening smell. Back in the bunker, he tore off the mask and vomited. The reality of what he had done hit him with the force of a hammer. Taking a life, even one so despicable, had left a stain on his soul. Arturo found him there, pale and trembling, and the question didn't need to be asked. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of the act. Mario looked at his hands, the same hands that once held his daughter, now stained in a way that could never be cleaned. He felt no remorse for Hector's death, but a profound horror at what he himself had become. The journey had only just begun, and he was already losing himself in the darkness he had sworn to fight. Is this what revenge does to you? Does it turn your pain into a weapon that ends up cutting you from the inside? I ask myself that every night. This story is a burden, and sharing it is the only way not to be crushed by it. If you are still with me, listening to this account, please consider subscribing, knowing there's someone on the other side, that this journey isn't a solitary one, gives me the strength to continue. Every subscription is a reminder that I'm not just talking to ghosts. Let me know you're there. Hector's death shook the underworld, not for the loss, as men, like him, were disposable, but for the way it happened. The body was found with a small square of polished iron placed over its eye, a cold and deliberate signature. The police dismissed it as a settling of scores, but the rumors began to spread. The media, sniffing out sensationalism, took the story and turned it into a legend. They christened him El Fantasma de Hierro, the Iron Ghost, a name that captured the imagination of a city fed up with cartel violence and police inaction. The Ghost became an urban myth overnight, a vengeful angel to some, a new kind of monster to others. The case landed on the desk of Detective Sofia Rios. In a department mired in corruption and apathy, Sofia was an anomaly. She was tireless, intelligent, and possessed a moral compass that refused to break. She read the report on Hector's death and immediately knew this was different. The method, the precision, the calling card left behind. It wasn't the work of a common gangster. It was the work of someone with discipline and a clear purpose. While her colleagues scoffed at the Ghost, she began to dig, treating the myth as a puzzle. She didn't see a hero, she saw a killer, and she was determined to find the man behind the iron mask. As the legend grew, Mario became bolder and more efficient. The second and third men on his list, the other sicarios from that fateful night, were eliminated in the following weeks. Each operation was cleaner, faster. The hesitation from the first time was replaced by a lethal precision. He learned from every mistake, honing his tactics and his technology. He moved through the city like an apparition, using the urban infrastructure to his advantage, disappearing into service tunnels or blending into the industrial landscape he knew so well. He left no fingerprints, no witnesses, only the body and the small iron token, feeding the fire of his own terrifying myth. In his luxurious lair, Ricardo El Chacal Vargas finally began to pay attention. The loss of 3 men in quick succession was an annoyance, but the manner of their deaths was an insult. Initially, he suspected a rival cartel trying to move in on his territory, but the method was too strange. There was no claim of responsibility, no territorial gain. It was something personal, surgical. Vargas, a predator who understood the psychology of fear, was intrigued and enraged. Someone was hunting his men with the same coldness as an exterminator dealing with an infestation. He ordered his lieutenants to find out who this Ghost was and bring him his head on a platter. The city wasn't big enough for 2 monsters. Mario knew that eliminating the foot soldiers was only the beginning. To destroy a snake, you had to cut off its head. But first, he needed to weaken the body. His next target was an accountant named Morales, the financial brain who laundered the cartel's blood money through front companies. Attacking the finances was more dangerous, as it would bring him closer to the center of power. He broke into the accountant's front office, not with the brute force of before, but with the subtlety of a spy. He wasn't there just to kill, but to extract information, to steal the data that would expose Vargas's entire web of corruption, including his protectors in the government. Detective Sofia Rios's investigation had led her to a dead end, until she noticed a pattern everyone else had overlooked. The 3 men killed by the Ghost were listed as unidentified informants in the archived report of the Ortiz family murder. It was a footnote buried in bureaucracy, but to her it shone like a spotlight. She tried to reopen the case, but was met with a wall of resistance. Her captain, a man whose eyes avoided hers, warned her to let the dead rest. The veiled threat only confirmed her suspicions. The deaths of the Ortiz family and the rise of the Ghost were intrinsically linked. The hunt for a mysterious killer had become something far more dangerous. The cartel's response was swift and brutal. Knowing the Ghost was hunting them, they decided to hunt back. They set a trap, using one of their own lieutenants as bait. But Mario, with his vast surveillance network, saw the trap being laid before it was even set. He watched the hunters take their positions, analyze their escape routes and their blind spots. Then, instead of avoiding the trap, he disarmed it from within. He moved among them like an invisible predator, eliminating them one by one. In the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, when morning came, the bait was dead, and the hunters had become the hunted. The message was clear: the Ghost could not be hunted. In the midst of the war, Mario's loneliness was his most constant enemy. The bunker was a self-imposed prison, and his only human contact was with Arturo. One night, observing the city through a drone, he focused on a park. He saw a father pushing his daughter on a swing, and the image hit him with the force of a physical blow. The little girl's laughter, carried on the wind, was a ghostly echo of Sophia's. For a moment the iron mask on his soul cracked, and grief flooded him, fresh and overwhelming. He was a ghost, not only to his enemies, but to himself, haunted by a life he could never have again, fighting for a future in which he had no place. Arturo sensed the change in Mario. Efficiency was becoming cruelty. Justice was turning into sadism. Before a mission to eliminate a cartel lieutenant, Arturo placed a photo on the planning table. He has a wife and an 8-year-old son, Mario. The boy has nothing to do with this. The intent was clear, to force Mario to see the humanity in his targets. But Mario looked at the photo without emotion. "I had a family too," he replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. Where was their mercy? The chasm between the two men was growing. Arturo feared that by the end of his crusade, there would be nothing left of the man he had sworn to protect. Sophia's profile of the ghost was becoming frighteningly accurate. The assailant had nearly unlimited financial resources, access to cutting-edge technology, and an intimate knowledge of the city's industrial landscape. And above all, a powerful motive. She compiled a short list of individuals who had been brutally victimized by the Vargas cartel and possessed the means to retaliate. There were few names on the list, but one stood out, surrounded by a suspicious silence. Mario Ortiz, the grieving recluse, owner of one of the country's largest steelworks. The idea seemed absurd, but Sophia's intuition told her she was on the right track. She decided it was time to pay the widower a visit. Mario's war escalated to a new level when he aimed for his most audacious target yet, Commander Salgado, a high-ranking police official who was Vargas's main protector within the law. To attack a police officer, even a corrupt one, was to cross a line of no return. It meant declaring war not just on a cartel, but on the state itself. The plan was risky and complex, involving the infiltration of a heavily guarded government building. Arturo begged him to reconsider, but Mario was adamant. To kill the snake, he had to remove its fangs, and Salgado was the most venomous fang of all. The operation would be the ultimate test of his skills and would bring him to the brink of destruction. The infiltration was a success, but the exfiltration was a disaster. Salgado had more security than anticipated. In the ensuing confrontation, Mario got the information he needed, the location of a ledger detailing all of Vargas's payments to police and politicians. But he was wounded, a bullet grazing his shoulder and a deep gash on his leg. He narrowly escaped, leaving behind a trail of blood, and crucially, a small sliver of a unique metal alloy from his armor that had broken off during the fight. He made it back to the bunker, but the victory had come at a high cost. He had exposed himself, leaving a clue that a tenacious investigator like Sofia Rios would not overlook. As expected, the small metal sliver was the key Sofia needed. The forensic lab analysis identified it as an experimental alloy, not commercially available, whose chemical composition was registered in patents. There was only one company in all of Mexico with the capability and the patent to produce that kind of material: Ortiz Steelworks. All the pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place, forming a terrifying and logical picture. The grieving widower and the avenging ghost were the same person. The evidence was circumstantial, but Sophia's conviction was absolute. She had her man. Now she just had to prove it. The news of the attack on Commander Salgado and the theft of his secret information reached Ricardo Vargas like a thunderclap. The ghost was no longer a street problem. He was an existential threat. He had breached the sanctuary of his power, proving that no one was safe. Paranoia set in among his inner circle. Vargas, consumed by fury, summoned his top enforcer, a man known as El Martillo, the Hammer. a psychopath whose only skill was extreme violence. The order was simple: find the ghost, dismember him slowly, and bring the Iron Mask to Vargas as a trophy. The subtle hunt was over. All-out war had begun. While recovering, Mario was notified that Detective Sofia Rios had scheduled a visit to his mansion for a follow-up interview. The timing was too dangerous to be a coincidence. With his arm in a sling beneath an expensive suit, he received her, playing the part of the broken man the world believed him to be. The conversation was a tense chess match. Sofia asked seemingly innocent questions about his business and his routine, but her sharp eyes analyzed his every move, every hesitation. Mario answered in the monotone of a man medicated by grief, but inwardly his mind raced, knowing he was in the presence of the one person in the city who could unmask him. The meeting with Sofia was a catalyst. He realized his time operating in the shadows was running out. The police and the cartel were closing in. His war of attrition, while effective, was too slow. The information he extracted from Commander Salgado contained the final piece of the puzzle, the location of a high-level meeting that El Chacal Vargas himself would hold at one of his industrial slaughterhouses, a place he considered impenetrable. Mario made a decision. The dismantling phase was over. It was time to abandon strategy and go straight for the enemy's heart. He would attack the serpent's nest, confront the man who ordered his family's death, and end it all, once and for all, whatever the cost. The steelworks was Mario's personal hell, and it was there he would drag his demons. The rain fell in torrents, hissing against the hot metal of the buildings as he infiltrated the complex. He was no stranger there. He was the creator of that steel labyrinth. Every shadow was an ally, every roar of the furnaces. Disguise. Ricardo Vargas had chosen the heart of Mario's empire as his meeting point, a display of power and arrogance, believing the reclusive Ortiz was too broken to notice. He turned Mario's house into his den, not knowing that the ghost of the master of the house was already walking the halls, an iron spectre moving with lethal purpose, ready to purge the desecrated sanctuary with fire and retribution. The path to Vargas was guarded by his most faithful hound, El Martillo, and a dozen of his most lethal men. The confrontation took place in the foundry, a hellish landscape of molten metal and scalding steam. It wasn't a battle of tactics, but an explosion of brutal violence. Mario didn't fight like a soldier, but as a part of the machinery itself. He opened pressure valves to create curtains of steam, blinding his enemies. He used electromagnetic cranes to drop tons of scrap metal, crushing them under the weight of his own industrial domain. The fight with El Martillo was a savage duel between brute force and relentless precision, ending with the giant falling into a pit of incandescent slag. Mario emerged from the chaos wounded, exhausted, but victorious. He found Vargas on the observation deck, calmly smoking a cigar as he watched the orange glow of the liquid steel below. There was no panic in his eyes, only an amused curiosity. "So the ghost finally appears," Vargas said, his voice calm amid the industrial noise. The physical confrontation was anticlimactic. Mario, driven by a cold adrenaline, crossed the distance between them in seconds. Vargas's two bodyguards were neutralized with brutal efficiency before they could react. He disarmed Vargas and forced him to his knees, the blade of his knife against the cartel leader's throat. With his enemy finally at his mercy, the noise of the factory seemed to fade away, leaving only the heavy breathing of the two men and the looming question, what now? Vargas, even on his knees, showed no fear. He smiled, a venomous smile that pierced Mario's armor. "You think you're different from me?" he sneered, his voice full of contempt. "We're both men who lost everything and decided to burn the world for it. You hide behind that iron mask and call it justice, but I see you for what you are, a wounded animal that only knows how to bite." Every word was a psychological attack, designed to corrode Mario's justification. "I built an empire with fear. You became a legend with pain. In the end, We're just two. Monsters fighting for control of the same hell. Kill me and take my throne of ashes. Mario's rage was a contained storm, ready to explode. And then Vargas dealt the final blow, the cruelest truth of all. You know what the funniest part is? Your family. He laughed, a hideous sound that echoed through the space. It was a mistake. My men were after a judge who lived on the same street. They got the wrong house. Your wife and daughter, they meant nothing, just collateral damage in a botched operation. The revelation struck Mario with the force of a forge hammer. His crusade, his pain, his transformation, all built on the foundation of a personal vendetta for a targeted act of evil, was a lie. His tragedy wasn't the center of the universe. It was a banal footnote in someone else's story. Mario's universe contracted to that single moment. The pain, the rage, the futility of everything he had done flooded him. The temptation to end it all right there, to grant Vargas oblivion and himself the savage satisfaction of vengeance, was overwhelming. He could feel the handle of the knife in his hand, the pulse throbbing in Vargas's throat. He looked down and saw his distorted reflection on the polished metal floor, the featureless mask staring back at him. Was it the face of a monster, as Vargas said, or was it something else? To kill Vargas now would be to give in to his pain, proving the cartel leader right. It would be the end of his journey, but the annihilation of his soul. With a cry that was more of agony than of rage, Mario pulled back. Justice wasn't death. Death was an escape. True justice was accountability. He pressed a device on his belt, and across the city, the inboxes of journalists and law enforcement agencies simultaneously received the files from Salgado's ledger. Vargas's network of corruption was exposed to the world. Then, with a branding iron he had brought, heated in the flames of the furnace, he pressed the ghost symbol onto Vargas's face. "You're not going to die," Mario said, his voice a metallic growl through the mask's modulator. "You're going to live. You'll live to see your empire crumble, to be hunted by those you paid and betrayed by those you trusted. I am not your revenge. I am your legacy." The next morning, Mexico City awoke in flames, not of fire, but of information. The barrage of data released by Mario hit every major newspaper and television network, exposing decades of rot connecting the Vargas cartel to judges, generals, and politicians. It was an institutional earthquake. Ricardo El Chacal Vargas was found at his slaughterhouse, not by rivals, but by the Marines. The image of his face, branded with the ghost's symbol, became the face of unmasked impunity. His fall was spectacular, but it brought no joy, only the bitter understanding of the depth of the disease afflicting the nation. Amid the chaos of arrests and furious denials, no one noticed that the man who lit the fuse, Mario Ortiz, had vanished. The iron ghost had served his purpose and dissolved back into the night. At police headquarters, Detective Sofia Rios watched the media circus with a mixture of triumph and resignation. On her desk lay the final file on the ghost case, containing the metal sliver and her irrefutable conclusions pointing to Mario Ortiz. She had the power to expose everything, to tell the world the full story of the billionaire who became an angel of death. But she realized the truth was more complicated than the law. Revealing the ghost's identity would turn the greatest witness against state corruption into a serial killer, discrediting the entire revelation and allowing the powerful to hide behind the scandal. With a heavy sigh, she wrote her final recommendation: "Case closed. Suspect unknown, presumed deceased in conflict with the cartel." She chose the city's justice over the letter of the law. In the silence of the bunker beneath the steelworks, Arturo Morales performed the final shutdown. Protocol. The servers were wiped, the hard drives incinerated, and the remnants of one man's war were systematically eliminated. On the main monitor, a single message awaited him. It wasn't a farewell, nor an explanation, just 3 words. "Thank you, my friend." Along with the message were the details of a new identity and a Swiss bank account with enough funds to last 10 lifetimes. Arturo looked at the iron mask Mario had left behind on the table, the only physical trace of the ghost. He picked it up, feeling the weight of the cold metal, and took it with him, the last guardian of the secret of a man who had sacrificed his soul to avenge his families. The months passed. The city, as always, moved on. Vargas's fall left a power vacuum that other cartels scrambled to fill, and the violence continued. But something had changed. The legend of the Iron Ghost refused to die. It became a cautionary tale for the corrupt and a dark symbol of hope for the oppressed. The name Mario Ortiz was added to Mexico's long list of the disappeared, and his vast fortune was quietly funneled into a charitable fund for victims of violence. He had no funeral, no grave. His only tombstone was the iron mark he left on the city's soul, a permanent question about the price of justice and the nature of vengeance. And so he was gone, neither a hero nor a monster, but a ghost forever haunted by the phantoms he himself had created. He found no peace, no redemption. He might have sought only the end of a painful equation. His story serves as a warning that when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Thank you for staying with me until the end, for bearing witness to this descent into darkness. It is because of listeners like you that these stories can be told. If Mario's journey touched you, I ask, one last time, that you subscribe. It ensures that more voices that would otherwise be silenced will find a way. Now, all that remains is the silence and the legend of the Iron Ghost.